Hello and welcome to Plugged In Politics. I'm your host, Jace Wilkey, and I hope you all had an awesome 4th of July. As per tradition, I hope it was filled with hot dogs and as much gunpowder and freedom as the American dollar can buy. Today we're going to be covering the highlights of the Supreme Court season. So, June is an interesting month in the political world as the Supreme Court releases its rulings for that given year. Now, on the docket for this summer, we have some pretty intense issues ranging from discrimination to federal election rules. But let's be clear here, guys. Following the rulings of Dobbs v. Jackson and Kennedy versus Bremerton School District in 2022, we're not really working with a judicially honest court. So, to set the record straight, heading into this ruling season, I expected absolute horrible outcomes. So how did it turn out? Well, that's the question for all three segments for today's show. So we're going to start things off with the Supreme Court case on affirmative action, and then follow that up with the Moore v. Harper independent state legislator theory case, and then end the show on the 303 Creative LLC versus Ellenist discrimination case. Make sure to follow the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts so you don't miss a single upload, and feel free to follow the show on Twitter and Instagram to stay plugged in on any updates and new stories. Also, the show is now on YouTube. I split the show up into segments and then upload them there. I gotta say, the love received on the Boebert and MTG video was amazing, so please make sure to go check that out and give it a watch. Also, toss me a bone and subscribe. I really need it. Now, with that out of the way, sit back, grab some hot dogs, and watch the fireworks fly. Okay, so first up on the docket, we have the Supreme Court striking down affirmative action, the college admissions practice of accounting for race-based admissions. So, out of nature, the court decided by a majority of 6-3 that Harvard University and the Public University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill violated the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution's 14th Amendment by considering race, alongside other factors such as grades and test scores, in their admissions policies. The decision deprives universities of a crucial tool in the ongoing struggle to establish more diverse and more equitable educational environments. Now, race-conscious policies, also known as affirmative action, were initially established to redress generations of harm that racism had caused to black people in the United States. They were conceived in the years after Brown v. Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, the landmark 1954 Supreme Court ruling to desegregate schools. Some white majority communities fought vehemently to maintain segregation. Affirmative action was an acknowledgement that with robust efforts to diversify workplaces and student bodies, segregation, although no longer enshrined in law, would effectively continue by default through existing disparities in educational and professional achievement. So, away from the article, my thoughts on this. I understand that there is a mixed understanding of race-based admission policies, but it's also important to account for the fact that although social and voting policies have progressed, there are numerous factors that hold, underserved communities of color. Generations of people who are the descendants of slaves and populations that were redlined to hell and back, no shit, it's not hard to imagine that people face certain factors that, white and legacy populations simply don't face. To be fair, I think that affirmative action is a clumsy but harmless attempt to make sure that student bodies are representative of the population. However, this has led to some glaring issues, particularly in Northeast and Pacific universities such as Harvard and UCLA. Asian applicants, for example, that apply to these universities tend to come from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, so they end up having a lower chance of being accepted. That was one of the main issue points that stirred up this case. But let's also not kid ourselves here. A policy on colorblindness, as altruistic as it may sound, ends up having negative outcomes. For example, literacy laws and grandfather clauses were used to bar former slaves from voting following the Civil War. These laws had no written statements directly tied to race. However, in practice, they prevented populations that were unable to read from voting, which, at the time, was predominantly made up of former slaves. Now, to account for white rural populations that were literate, grandfather clauses were meant to permit people to vote who had grandfathers that were literate. In fact, Justice Sotomayor touched on this topic in her dissenting opinion, affirming the Equal Protection Clause while still dissenting on the overall ruling, saying that the previous cases have, quote, concluded that this guarantee can be enforced through race-conscious means in a society that is not and never has been colorblind, end quote. I also think it's important to look at just how, quote-unquote, important race really is in the admissions process. In fact, according to Ballotpedia, it turns out that only 20% of universities in the United States utilize race-based admission policies. And this is largely made up of, elite universities such as Ivy Leagues. These make up a relatively small portion of college admissions in the United States. And it really isn't going to affect the broader population. And let's be clear, a guy like me, I'm not going to get into an Ivy League. It really doesn't affect normal average Joes, to be honest. I think generally this is not a great ruling overall, largely because it will deprive genuine talent from underserved areas from opportunities in elite higher education. Like, let's think of a hypothetical situation here. Like, if it's between a legacy Harvard kid with a 4.0 GPA in Beacon Hill, Boston, versus a kid with the same GPA and accomplishments from, say, a lower income neighborhood, I'm likely going to go for the latter. The legacy kid isn't missing out on anything. Let's not delude ourselves here. They could go anywhere. The world is practically already in their hands. They won the sperm lottery. Look, all this to say, I don't know what to say, honestly. This feels like a rather lame attempt to dismiss a relatively harmless accommodation that ensures that higher education is somewhat available to all demographics of the country. Even as, oftentimes misplaced or sometimes clumsy as it can be, I can't in any world really defend the decision to strike it down. It's just not ethical. Now, it'll be interesting to see what happens to elite universities and if any political interaction takes place, but I doubt it, though. It was a quick pump and dump scheme for the right. They're going to get their, their brownie points amongst their base out in the, rural areas of the United States where they're going to win their districts anyway. But it basically just locks them up. It's a quick win. It's a one-night stand win, gets them a few headlines for about a month. And honestly, we're probably not going to see much of this in the future unless, the traction that I've heard about online and through some articles about trying to target legacy admissions policies, that would be an interesting conversation. And if the Supreme Court does not strike down legacy policies, this is going to be a complete hypocritical farce. I mean, just straight up. But we're going to have to wait to see. And honestly, I would not lose any sleep if we tear away that, that backdoor, right of birth policy for these kids. I'm not going to lie. It kind of makes me sick sometimes.